The sound of shattering glass pierced the early morning quiet of Salida, Colorado, as Emma Turner ducked behind the general store, her trembling hand clutching her slightly rounded belly. At 22, she never imagined she'd be 6 months pregnant and running for her life in the spring of 1876. The shopkeeper's angry shouts followed her down the alley, words like harlot and disgrace cutting deeper than the scattered glass that had nicked her arm when he'd thrown the jar at her retreating form. Emma's breath came in ragged gasps as she leaned against the rough wooden wall, the April sun not yet high enough to warm the mountain air. 3 months ago, she'd arrived in Salida with dreams of a teaching position and the promise of a new beginning. Now those dreams lay in ruins, much like her reputation. The father of her child, a traveling salesman who'd wooed her with promises of marriage, had disappeared with the winter snows, leaving nothing but a growing child in her womb and whispers that followed her through town. "You ain't welcome here no more, Miss Turner," the shopkeeper bellowed from the back door of his establishment. "Decent folk don't want your kind round their children." Emma straightened her spine, one hand protectively covering her belly. "I need food, Mr. Barton. I have money to pay." "Don't want your money. Don't want you. The school board was right to let you go." A week ago, Emma had stood before 5 stern-faced men who'd informed her that an unwed mother had no business teaching their children. Her pleading had fallen on deaf ears, leaving her with no income and dwindling savings. "Best be on your way before I call the sheriff," Barton added, his face contorted with disgust. Emma felt tears threatening but refused to let them fall. Clutching her worn shawl tighter around her shoulders, she turned away and walked toward the main street. She needed supplies, food, at least, but it seemed every shop in Salida had decided she was unfit to serve. The street was beginning to fill with morning traffic wagons loaded with goods from nearby farms, merchants opening their shops, miners heading to the saloon after night shifts in the hills. Emma kept her head down, avoiding the stares that followed her. The irony wasn't lost on her that the same townsfolk who shunned her had no qualms about the saloon girls or the brothel at the edge of town. As she approached the second general store, the only other option in Salida, Emma straightened her shoulders and took a deep breath. Perhaps Mr. Wilson would be more charitable than Barton had been. She stepped through the door, the bell announcing her arrival. Wilson, a balding man with spectacles perched on his nose, looked up from behind the counter. His expression hardened immediately. "Miss Turner." "Good morning, Mr. Wilson. I need some flour and beans, please, and perhaps some dried fruit if you have it." The man crossed his arms. "I think not. I have money to pay. This isn't about money. Wife and I talked it over last night. We don't serve your kind here." Emma felt her face flush. "My kind? I'm simply a woman in need of food." "You're a woman who didn't wait for marriage, made your bed, now lie in it." He gestured toward the door. "There are other towns down the valley." "Please, Mr. Wilson, I can't travel in my condition." "Should have thought of that before you." The door opened behind Emma, the bell jingling cheerfully in stark contrast to the tension in the room. Heavy boots thudded on the wooden floor, and a deep voice drawled, "Morning, Wilson." Emma didn't turn, too humiliated to face another town resident. She heard Wilson's tone change immediately. "Mr. Shaw, good to see you. What can I get for you today? Need supplies for the trail, heading back to the ranch tomorrow." The voice came closer, and Emma sensed someone standing beside her. From the corner of her eye she glimpsed worn leather boots and denim-clad legs. "I'll get right to that," Wilson said eagerly. "Just finishing up here." "No, you weren't," the newcomer said, his voice calm but carrying an edge of steel. "Seems to me the lady was trying to make a purchase." Emma finally looked up. Standing beside her was a tall man with sun-bronzed skin and eyes the color of a summer storm. His dark hair was slightly too long, curling at the nape of his neck beneath a well-worn hat. He couldn't have been more than 30, with a strong jawline shadowed by a day's growth of beard. Wilson cleared his throat. "Now, Mr. Shaw, you don't understand the situation. This woman has money to spend like anyone else," the stranger finished for him. His eyes never left Wilson's face, though Emma felt his awareness of her like a physical presence. "She's in a delicate condition," Wilson said pointedly. "Unmarried." The stranger Shaw finally turned to look at Emma fully. His gaze swept over her, pausing briefly on her rounded belly before returning to her face. Something flickered in his eyes, not judgment, but something Emma couldn't quite name. He turned back to Wilson. "I don't see how that's your concern. The lady needs supplies." "Now see here, Mr. Shaw, we have standards in Salida." "Standards?" Shaw's laugh was short and humorless. "That why you serve the miners who come down from their claims stinking of whiskey and worse? Why you take money from Dalan who beats his wife black and blue? Those your standards, Wilson?" The shopkeeper's face turned crimson. "That's different." "No, it ain't." Shaw turned to Emma. "What do you need, madam?" Stunned by his intervention, Emma stammered out her list. "Flour, beans, perhaps some dried fruit." Shaw nodded and faced Wilson again. "Add that to my order. And throw in some coffee and sugar too." Wilson hesitated, looking between them with narrowed eyes. "Mr. Shaw, I understand you're new to our community, but this woman is with me." The simple declaration hung in the air. Emma's head snapped up to stare at the stranger, who stood calm and unmoving as though he hadn't just upended her world with 3 small words. "With you." Wilson looked as shocked as Emma felt. Shaw nodded once, then placed his hand gently at the small of Emma's back. The touch was light, respectful, but unmistakably possessive. "That's right. Now about those supplies." Wilson's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water before he finally nodded and began gathering the items. Emma stood frozen, unable to comprehend what had just happened or why this stranger would come to her aid in such a dramatic fashion. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Shaw looked down at her, his expression unreadable. "No need for thanks." His voice was pitched low for her ears only. "Name's Hayes Shaw, got a ranch about 15 miles outside town. Emma Turner, Miss Turner." He tipped his hat slightly. "Seems you've had a rough morning." Emma's laugh held no humor. "A rough few months, Mr. Shaw." His eyes softened slightly. "Hayes, and I reckon we should talk, once we're done here." Wilson returned with their supplies wrapped in brown paper. Hayes paid without comment, though Emma noticed the shopkeeper had added extra to her order: sugar, coffee, and a small bag of hard candies she hadn't asked for. Hayes gathered the packages in one arm and offered his other to Emma. "Shall we?" Bewildered but with few options, Emma placed her hand in the crook of his arm. Together they walked out of the store, leaving Wilson staring after them with undisguised curiosity. Outside, the street had grown busier, and Emma felt the weight of stares following them. Hayes seemed oblivious to the attention, guiding her toward a wagon hitched near the hitching post. "Mr. Shaw Hayes," Emma corrected herself. "I appreciate your kindness, but I don't understand." He helped her up onto the wagon seat before replying. "Didn't seem right, the way they were treating you, but you claimed I was with you." Emma felt heat rise to her cheeks. Hayes placed the packages in the back of the wagon before climbing up beside her. Seemed the quickest way to shut Wilson up. He took up the reins, then hesitated. "Where can I take you, Miss Turner?" The question brought reality crashing back. "I have a room at Mrs. Hollister's boarding house, though I'm not sure for how long." At his questioning look, she added, "I lost my teaching position last week. Without income, I'll soon run out of money for rent. Hayes nodded slowly as though considering something. Mrs. Hollister's, then, and perhaps we can continue our conversation there. Emma knew she should refuse. She'd already allowed this stranger to escort her from the store. Propriety demanded she thank him politely and send him on his way. But the warmth of his presence beside her, the first kindness she'd been shown in weeks, made her hesitate. "Yes," she said finally. "I'd like that." Hayes clicked to the horses, and the wagon moved forward. As they traveled the short distance to the boarding house, Emma felt the stares of townspeople tracking their progress. By sundown, she knew, all of Salida would be buzzing with the news that Emma Turner had been seen in the company of Hayes Shaw. For once, she found she didn't care. Mrs. Hollister's boarding house sat at the quieter end of town, a two-story wooden structure with a small porch and neat flower boxes beneath the windows. Hayes helped Emma down from the wagon with gentle hands that belied his strength. "I'll bring your supplies," he said, gathering the packages. Emma led the way up the steps, aware of Mrs. Hollister's curtains twitching in the front parlor window. The older woman had been one of the few in town who hadn't openly shunned Emma, though she'd made it clear that her acceptance was conditional on Emma finding new accommodations once the baby arrived. "Miss Turner." Mrs. Hollister appeared in the doorway, her eyes widening at the sight of Hayes behind Emma. "And Mr. Shaw, isn't it, madam?" Hayes tipped his hat. "Just helping Miss Turner with her purchases, Mrs. Hollister's gaze darted between them, clearly calculating the gossip value of what she was witnessing. "How neighborly of you. May we use the parlor for a brief conversation?" Emma asked. The landlady hesitated only a moment before nodding. "Of course. I was just about to visit with Mrs. Chambers down the street." Her eyes gleamed with anticipation of being the first to share this development. Once Mrs. Hollister had donned her hat and departed with barely concealed excitement, Emma led Hayes to the small parlor. The room was modestly furnished but neat, with a worn settee and two chairs arranged around a small fireplace. "Please, sit." Emma gestured to one of the chairs while taking the settee herself. Hayes set her packages aside and removed his hat, revealing thick dark hair that he ran his fingers through self-consciously. He sat, the wooden chair seeming too small for his frame. "I owe you my gratitude," Emma began, "but I'm still puzzled why you'd involve yourself in my troubles." Hayes studied her for a moment. Sometimes a man just knows when something ain't right. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "Word gets around, even out to my place. Heard about the new school teacher who got herself in trouble." His expression softened. "Heard how the town turned on you." Emma felt her defenses rise. "And you thought you'd come to the rescue of the fallen woman?" "No, madam." Hayes didn't flinch at her tone. "I thought I'd help someone being treated unjustly. Man who did this to you, he walk away free and clear. Thomas Wilson." Not related to the shopkeeper, though they share a surname. He was a traveling salesman who came through last fall. Emma's hands twisted in her lap. "He promised marriage before we. Well, he left when the first snow fell. I didn't know I was with child until after." Hayes nodded slowly. "And the town blames you alone. As is the way of things." Emma lifted her chin. "I knew the risks still ain't right." Hayes was quiet for a moment. "Miss Turner, I have a proposition for you." Emma stiffened. Despite his kindness, she didn't know this man. "Mr. Shaw, not that kind of proposition," he added quickly, a faint flush coloring his cheekbones. "I need someone to keep house at my ranch. Cook, clean, that sort of thing. Got a small cabin you could use separate from the main house. Decent pay." Emma blinked in surprise. "You're offering me employment?" "Yes, madam. Despite my condition," Hayes shrugged. "Baby don't change your ability to cook, I reckon." Emma studied him, searching for hidden motives. Why would you do this? Told you need help at the ranch. My previous housekeeper left to care for her ailing mother 2 months back. Been managing, but not well, he hesitated. And maybe I know something about being judged unfairly. There was a story there, Emma sensed, but she didn't press. The town will talk. Town already talks. Difference is, out at my place, you won't have to hear it. Hayes stood, retrieving his hat. Think on it. I'll be at the hotel tonight, leaving after breakfast tomorrow. You decide you want the position, be at the hotel by 8 with whatever you want to bring. Emma rose as well. This is most unexpected. Life usually is. Hayes settled his hat back on his head. Good day, Miss Turner. Emma watched from the parlor window as he climbed back into his wagon and drove away, his broad shoulders straight, his posture confident. She placed a hand on her belly, feeling the flutter of movement within. What do you think, little one? She whispered. Is this our chance? The baby kicked in response, and Emma smiled for the first time in days. Perhaps it was. The night passed slowly for Emma, her mind racing with considerations. Leaving Salida for the ranch of a man she barely knew carried risks, but staying meant facing increasing hostility as her pregnancy advanced. By morning, she'd made her decision. Emma packed her meager belongings into a single trunk. Her teaching credentials, a few books, clothing that would soon no longer fit her expanding figure, and the small silver hairbrush that had belonged to her mother, these were the sum of her worldly possessions. She wrote a note for Mrs. Hollister, explaining her departure and enclosing payment for the full month's rent, despite leaving early. At 7:45, Emma stood outside the Salida Hotel, her trunk beside her on the boardwalk. The morning was cool, the mountains to the west still shadowed while the sun climbed above the eastern plains. Several early risers gave her curious glances, especially when Hayes emerged from the hotel precisely at 8 o'clock. His expression revealed nothing as he approached, but Emma thought she detected relief in his eyes. You decided to come. It wasn't a question, Emma nodded. Yes, thank you for the opportunity. Hayes lifted her trunk as though it weighed nothing, carrying it to the wagon already loaded with supplies. Journey takes about 3 hours. Road gets rough after we leave the main trail. Emma climbed onto the wagon seat with Hayes's assistance. As they prepared to depart, she noticed Reverend Matthews approaching with purposeful strides. Mr. Shaw, the preacher called. A word, if you please. Hayes sighed but turned to face the man. Reverend. Matthews glanced at Emma with barely concealed disapproval before addressing Hayes. I understand you're taking Miss Turner to your ranch. That's right. As a man of God, I must express concern about the arrangement. Hayes's expression hardened. Miss Turner is my housekeeper. She'll have her own cabin. The Reverend lowered his voice, though Emma could still hear him clearly. The appearance of impropriety, Mr. Shaw. Surely you understand that an unmarried woman in her condition is still deserving of work and shelter, Hayes interrupted. Good day, Reverend. Before Matthews could respond, Hayes clicked to the horses and the wagon lurched forward. Emma clutched the seat as they left the town behind, a mixture of relief and apprehension filling her chest. I apologize for the Reverend, she said once Salida had diminished to a cluster of buildings in the distance. Hayes kept his eyes on the trail ahead. No need. Man's doing what he thinks is right, I suppose. You don't sound convinced. Been my experience that those who talk most about righteousness often have the least understanding of it. He glanced at her. Hope you don't mind the solitude. Ranch is peaceful, but it's a far cry from town life. After recent events, solitude sounds wonderful. Emma watched the landscape change as they traveled, the valley giving way to rolling hills dotted with pines. Have you had the ranch long? 5 years. Bought it from an old trapper who wanted to move on. Land wasn't worth much then, too far from town, too wild. Been building it up since. Alone. Hayes nodded. Got a couple of hands who help with the cattle. Good men. He hesitated. They don't live at the ranch, though, have their own places nearby. Emma understood his meaning. There would be no one else living on the property besides them. In town, such an arrangement would be scandalous, but out here in the wilderness, practical considerations outweighed social niceties. Tell me about the work, she said, changing the subject. Hayes seemed grateful for the shift. Nothing too strenuous. Cooking, keeping the house in order, mending. Wouldn't expect you to do heavy lifting or such, especially. He gestured vaguely toward her condition. I'm pregnant, Mr. Shaw, not incapacitated, Emma said, but without heat. I can work. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. I don't doubt it. The trail narrowed as they climbed higher, the wagon rocking over uneven ground. Hayes handled the team with practiced ease, his hands strong on the reins. Despite her initial reservations, Emma found herself relaxing in his company. There was something solid about him, dependable in a way that Thomas Wilson had never been, despite all his charming words. May I ask about your background? Emma ventured after a period of comfortable silence. You don't speak like most ranchers I've met. Hayes cast her a sidelong glance. Notice that, did you? Was raised back East Boston. Father was in shipping, expected me to join the family business. But you came west instead. After the war. His voice had taken on a distant quality. Served with the Union, after Gettysburg and what came after. Couldn't stomach the idea of ledgers and counting houses. Needed open sky. Emma nodded, understanding more than he probably realized. I came west for similar reasons. My parents died within a year of each other, influenza. The school in our Pennsylvania town had too many memories. When I saw the advertisement for a teacher in Colorado Territory, it seemed like Providence. Until Thomas Wilson, Hayes said quietly. Emma's hand moved to her belly. Yes, until him. They lapsed into silence again, but it wasn't uncomfortable. The sun climbed higher, warming the spring air as the wagon continued its steady progress into the foothills. Emma found herself studying Hayes when he wasn't looking, the way his hands handled the reins with confidence, the straight line of his back, the profile that might have been carved from the granite of the mountains they traversed. Near midday, Hayes pulled the wagon to a stop beside a small creek. Thought we might rest the horses. Have some food too if you're hungry. Emma realized she was famished. Yes, thank you. Hayes helped her down, his hands strong but gentle at her waist. He retrieved a bundle from the back of the wagon. Nothing fancy, bread, cheese, some dried beef. But it'll keep us going. They sat on a fallen log near the water's edge, the sound of the creek burbling over rocks providing a peaceful backdrop. Hayes unwrapped their simple meal and offered Emma the first choice. It looks wonderful, she said, selecting a piece of bread and cheese. I've been making do with whatever I could afford lately. Hayes frowned. You've been going hungry, Emma shrugged, uncomfortable with his concern. Not hungry exactly, just careful. That ends now, Hayes said firmly. Ranch produces plenty. Beef, vegetables from the garden, milk from 2 good cows. You'll eat well. I intend to earn my keep, Emma reminded him. I won't be accepting charity. Never thought you would. Hayes's expression softened. You strike me as a proud woman, Miss Turner. Pride is all I have left, Mr. Shaw. He studied her for a moment. Hayes, he corrected gently. Emma met his gaze. Emma. Something passed between them in that moment, an understanding, perhaps, or the beginning of trust. Emma looked away first, turning her attention back to the food. They ate in companionable silence, listening to the creek and the occasional call of a bird overhead. When they resumed their journey, Emma felt more at ease. The wagon climbed higher into the hills, the trail becoming rougher, but the scenery growing more beautiful with each mile. Pine forests gave way occasionally to meadows bright with early spring wildflowers, and in the distance, snow-capped peaks reached toward the azure sky. "Almost there," Hayes said as they crested a rise in the late afternoon. "Shaw Ranch is just beyond that stand of trees." Emma leaned forward, eager for her first glimpse of what would be her new home. As the wagon rounded the bend, the ranch came into view, nestled in a natural hollow surrounded by forested slopes. The main house was larger than Emma had expected, a substantial two-story structure built of logs and stone, with a wide porch wrapping around two sides. Nearby stood a barn, corrals, and several outbuildings. To one side, perhaps 100 yards from the main house, was a smaller cabin that Emma assumed would be hers. "It's beautiful," she breathed. Hayes looked pleased. "Been working on it every day since I bought the place. Still not finished to my mind, but it's coming along." He guided the wagon into the yard, bringing it to a stop before the main house. A large dog came bounding around the corner, a shaggy beast with the coloring of a wolf, but the friendly demeanor of a pet. "That's Buck," Hayes said as the dog approached, tail wagging. "He looks fearsome, but he's gentle as a lamb." As if to prove the point, Buck sat obediently beside the wagon, looking up at Emma with soulful eyes. "He's magnificent," Emma said, offering her hand for the dog to sniff. Buck gave her fingers a gentle lick, before turning his attention to Hayes, who had climbed down from the wagon. Hayes scratched the dog's ears affectionately, before coming around to help Emma down. As her feet touched the ground, Emma felt a strange sense of homecoming, as though some part of her recognized this place. "Let me show you to your cabin first," Hayes said. "Then I can give you the full tour once you're settled." Emma followed him toward the small cabin, Buck trotting alongside them. Up close, she could see that the cabin, while modest, had been built with care. A small porch with a rocking chair faced the main house, and curtains hung in the windows. Hayes opened the door, standing aside to let Emma enter first. The interior was simple but comfortable, a main room with a stone fireplace, a small kitchen area, and a doorway that presumably led to a bedroom. Everything was spotlessly clean, the furniture simple but well crafted. "My previous housekeeper left it in good order," Hayes explained. "There's fresh bedding in the chest, firewood stacked outside. Pump for water is just behind, shared with the main house." Emma turned slowly, taking it all in. After the cramped boarding house room, this space felt luxurious. "It's lovely. Bathroom's outside, I'm afraid," Hayes said apologetically. "Got plans to build proper facilities eventually, but for now there's an outhouse behind the cabin. There's a tin bath you can use. I can bring hot water from the main house when you need it." Emma appreciated his matter-of-fact approach to such practicalities. "This will do wonderfully, thank you." Hayes nodded, looking relieved. "I'll bring your trunk. Take your time getting settled. When you're ready, come up to the main house and I'll show you around the rest." Left alone, Emma explored her new home more thoroughly. The bedroom was small but adequate, with a double bed, a chest of drawers, and a small window that looked out toward the mountains. Someone, Hayes, she presumed, had placed a vase of wildflowers on the windowsill, a touch that brought unexpected tears to her eyes. By the time Hayes returned with her trunk, Emma had composed herself. "Thank you," she said as he set it at the foot of the bed. "Need help unpacking?" "No, I can manage." Hayes hesitated as though wanting to say more, then nodded. "I'll be at the house when you're ready." Emma took her time unpacking, arranging her few possessions in the drawers and on the small shelf by the bed. She changed into a fresh dress, one of her looser ones that still accommodated her growing belly, and took a moment to brush her hair and pin it back neatly. The walk to the main house gave Emma a chance to observe more of the ranch. Everything spoke of care and attention: the neat fencing, the well-maintained outbuildings, the small vegetable garden to one side of the house. This was not the property of a careless man. Hayes met her on the porch, Buck still at his heels. "Settled in all right?" "Yes, thank you." "Good. I'll show you around then." He offered his arm, and after a moment's hesitation, Emma took it. The tour began with the main house, a surprisingly spacious dwelling with a large kitchen, dining room, parlor, and Hayes's study on the ground floor. Upstairs were 3 bedrooms, though Hayes merely pointed out their location from the bottom of the stairs, maintaining propriety. "Kitchen's where you'll spend most of your time, I reckon," he said, leading her into the large, well-equipped space. "Got a good stove, plenty of storage." Emma ran her hand appreciatively over the large wooden table in the center of the room. "This is wonderful. Made it myself," Hayes said, a note of pride in his voice. "Like working with wood when I have time." They continued to the barn, where Hayes introduced her to the horses and explained the basic operation of the ranch: the cattle, the small flock of chickens, the 2 milk cows. By the time they returned to the main house, the sun was beginning to set, painting the western sky in brilliant orange and gold. "You must be tired," Hayes said, "and hungry too, I'd wager." As if on cue, Emma's stomach growled audibly, causing her to blush. "It seems I am." Hayes smiled, the first full smile she'd seen from him. It transformed his face, softening the hard lines and making him appear younger. "I'm no great cook, but I've got stew warming. Would you join me for dinner, unless you'd prefer to rest?" "Dinner would be lovely," Emma said. "Though tomorrow, I'll take over the cooking." They ate at the kitchen table, the simple beef stew proving better than Hayes had led her to believe. He explained more about the ranch as they ate: the seasonal rhythms, the work that needed doing, his plans for expansion. "You've built something remarkable here," Emma observed as Hayes served her a second portion without asking. "Been a lot of work," he admitted. "Worth it, though." He hesitated. "Can I ask about your plans, after the baby comes, I mean?" Emma set down her spoon. It was a question she'd asked herself countless times. "I'm not certain. I had hoped to continue teaching, but that seems unlikely now." "Why? An unwed mother teaching children? No town would hire me." Hayes frowned. "Seems short-sighted. You didn't stop knowing your letters and figures." Emma smiled sadly. "The world doesn't always operate on logic, Hayes." "You're welcome to stay," he said, the words coming quickly. "After the baby, the position is yours for as long as you want it." The offer touched Emma deeply. "That's very generous." "It's practical," Hayes countered. "Good help is hard to find out here." But there was something in his eyes that suggested more than practicality, a warmth that Emma wasn't ready to examine too closely. Instead, she changed the subject, asking about the books she'd noticed in his study. They talked until the kitchen grew dark, Hayes lighting lamps as the conversation flowed easily between them. Emma found herself laughing at his dry humor, relaxing in a way she hadn't in months. When she finally rose to leave, citing tiredness, Hayes walked her to her cabin, lantern in hand. "Sleep well, Emma," he said at her door. "Tomorrow's a new beginning." Watching him walk back toward the main house, his tall figure silhouetted against the night sky, Emma felt something unfamiliar stir within her: not just gratitude, but a warmth she'd thought herself incapable of feeling again after Thomas's betrayal. "A new beginning," she whispered to herself, one hand on her belly. "For both of us." The weeks that followed fell into a comfortable rhythm. Emma rose early each day, preparing breakfast in the main house before Hayes went out to work with the cattle. She spent her days cleaning, cooking, and gradually turning the somewhat Spartan main house into a home. Hayes never commented directly on the changes: the curtains she sewed for the parlor windows, the wildflowers she arranged on the dining table, but she sometimes caught him looking at them with quiet appreciation. As May turned to June, Emma's pregnancy advanced, her belly growing rounder. Hayes never mentioned it directly, but she noticed how he began carrying the heavier water buckets without being asked, how he built a small bench on her porch for sitting in the evening air. Though they both knew it was to help her rest when the walk between cabins grew tiring. They took to spending evenings together on the porch of the main house, watching the sunset while Hayes smoked his pipe and Emma mended or knitted small garments for the baby. Their conversations ranged widely: books they'd read, places they'd seen, their hopes for the future. Hayes spoke little of the war, though occasionally he would mention a comrade or an incident in passing. Emma sensed that those memories were best left undisturbed. For her part, Emma found herself sharing more than she'd intended: her lonely childhood as the daughter of a strict schoolmaster, her dreams of creating a different kind of school where children learned through joy rather than fear, even her brief courtship with Thomas Wilson. "He had a way with words," she explained one evening in late June as they sat watching fireflies dance in the gathering darkness. "Made me feel special, chosen. I'd never felt that way before." Hayes was quiet for a long moment. "Men like that know exactly what to say." "Yes," Emma sighed. "I see that now. I was naive." "Not naive," Hayes corrected gently. "Just trusting. There's a difference." Emma looked over at him, his face half illuminated by the lantern hanging from the porch beam. "And you, Hayes, have you ever been in love?" The question was bold, perhaps too personal, but in the weeks they'd spent together, Emma had come to feel she could ask him almost anything. Hayes tapped his pipe against the porch rail, considering. "Once, girl back east before the war. Mary was her name." "What happened?" "Her father didn't approve. I was heading to war, no guarantees I'd return. He pushed her to marry a business associate instead, older man, established." Hayes shrugged, but Emma sensed the casualness was forced. She agreed. "Got the letter while I was at Antietam." "I'm sorry. Long time ago now." Hayes relit his pipe, the match briefly illuminating the shadows in his eyes. "Probably for the best. War changes a man. Came back different than I left." Emma wanted to ask more, but sensed he'd shared as much as he was willing to. Instead, she said, "Thank you for telling me." Hayes nodded, his gaze returning to the darkened landscape. "Ranch can be lonely. Nice, having someone to talk to." The simple admission warmed Emma more than she cared to admit. July brought scorching heat that made Emma's condition more uncomfortable. Hayes insisted she rest during the hottest part of the day, taking on some of her duties himself despite her protests. When the ranch hands came by, Emma noticed how they treated her with careful respect, following Hayes's lead in addressing her as Miss Turner and offering assistance without being asked. One blisteringly hot afternoon, Emma was resting in her cabin when a sharp pain seized her abdomen. She gasped, clutching the edge of her bed as the sensation rippled through her. When it passed, she tried to stand, only to feel wetness running down her legs. "No," she whispered, panic rising. "Not yet. It's too early." Another pain gripped her, stronger than the first. Emma managed to make it to the door of her cabin, calling out for Hayes. Her voice seemed small and ineffective against the vast landscape. Buck heard her first, the dog's ears perking up from where he'd been lying in the shade. He barked once, sharply, then raced toward the corrals where Hayes was mending fence. Emma saw Hayes look up at the dog's approach, then follow Buck's gaze to where she stood swaying in the doorway. Even from a distance, she saw his expression change to alarm. He dropped his tools and ran toward her, covering the ground between them with long strides. Emma. He reached her just as another pain struck, catching her as her knees buckled. "What's happening?" "The baby," she gasped. "It's coming, but it's too soon, only 7 months." Hayes's face paled, but his voice remained steady. "Let's get you inside." He lifted her easily, carrying her back into the cabin and to her bed. Emma clutched his shirt as another contraction seized her. "Need to get the doctor," Hayes said, laying her down gently. "No time," Emma panted. "Baby's coming too fast, and town's too far." Hayes ran a hand through his hair, looking uncharacteristically uncertain. "I don't know much about birthing babies, Emma." "Neither do I," she admitted with a strained laugh that turned into a grimace as another pain washed over her. "Mrs. Lawson," Hayes said suddenly. "Ranch about 5 miles east. She's midwifed half the children in the county. I'll ride for her." "Hurry," Emma whispered, fear gripping her as tightly as the contractions. Hayes squeezed her hand. "I'll be back as quick as I can. Buck will stay with you." As if understanding, the dog moved to lie beside the bed, his soulful eyes fixed on Emma. Hayes paused at the door. "You're strong, Emma. Remember that." Then he was gone, and Emma heard the thunder of hoofbeats as he galloped away. The contractions continued, growing stronger and closer together. Emma tried to remember what little she knew about childbirth from books and whispered conversations among married women. She managed to arrange blankets and towels, pausing when the pains became too intense to move. Buck remained vigilant beside her, occasionally whining when she cried out. "It's all right, boy," she reassured him during a brief respite between contractions. "This is just how babies come into the world." The sun was low in the sky when Emma heard horses approaching. Relief flooded her as Hayes burst through the door, followed by a stout, gray-haired woman carrying a large bag. "Well now, let's see what we've got here," the woman said briskly, shooing Hayes back out the door despite his reluctance to leave. "Men are useless at times like these. Go boil water and tear clean sheets into strips." The next few hours passed in a blur of pain and effort for Emma. Mrs. Lawson proved a capable midwife, her weathered hands gentle but firm as she guided Emma through the labor. Outside, Emma could hear Hayes pacing on the porch, his footsteps a reassuring presence even as she struggled. "Almost there, girl," Mrs. Lawson encouraged as Emma bore down with another contraction. "I can see the head. One more good push." Emma gathered her remaining strength, crying out as she pushed with everything she had. There was a moment of searing pain, then sudden relief, followed by the miraculous sound of a baby's first cry, high and indignant at being thrust into the cold world. "You've got a fine son, Mrs. Lawson announced, cleaning the tiny infant with practiced efficiency before placing him on Emma's chest. "Small but strong lungs. That's a good sign." Emma stared in wonder at the tiny face, the shock of dark hair, the perfect miniature fingers that curled reflexively around her own. "Hello," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Hello, little one." Mrs. Lawson completed her work, cleaning Emma and changing the bedding with remarkable speed before announcing, "I'll send in your man now. He's about worn a hole in your porch boards." Before Emma could correct her assumption about Hayes, the door opened and he entered hesitantly, his expression a mixture of concern and wonder. "Emma." His voice was soft, uncertain. "Come meet him," she said, unable to keep the joy from her voice despite her exhaustion. Hayes approached the bed slowly, his gaze fixed on the tiny bundle in Emma's arms. He sat carefully on the edge of the bed, looking both awed and terrified. "He's so small," he whispered. "Mrs. Lawson says he's strong, though." Emma adjusted the blanket so Hayes could see the baby's face better. "I thought perhaps I might name him Henry, after my father." "Henry," Hayes repeated, reaching out one finger to gently touch the baby's hand. The infant immediately grasped it, his tiny fingers barely spanning Hayes's fingertip. Something shifted in Hayes's expression, a softening, a vulnerability Emma had never seen before. "He's perfect, Emma." The words were simple, but the emotion behind them brought fresh tears to Emma's eyes. She had expected to face this moment alone, had prepared herself for the solitary burden of motherhood. Having Hayes beside her, looking at her son with such tenderness, was overwhelming. "Thank you," she said, "for everything." Hayes met her gaze, something unspoken passing between them. "No need for thanks," he said softly. "I'm just glad you're both all right." Mrs. Lawson bustled back in, breaking the moment. "Baby needs to nurse now and mother needs rest. You can come back in the morning, Mr. Shaw." Hayes nodded, reluctantly withdrawing his finger from Henry's grasp. "I'll be close if you need anything. Just call." After he left, Mrs. Lawson helped Emma position the baby for his first feeding. "That's a good man you've got," she commented as Henry latched on successfully. "He's not mine," Emma corrected gently. "He's my employer, Mrs." Lawson raised a skeptical eyebrow. "Employer who rides like the devil himself to fetch me for you, who nearly wore out my ears asking if you'd be all right, who looks at your baby like he hung the moon," she snorted softly. "If you say so, dear." Emma didn't argue further, too tired and too confused by her own feelings to engage. Instead, she focused on her son, marveling at the miracle of him. Mrs. Lawson stayed the night, sleeping in a chair beside the bed to monitor both mother and child. By morning, she pronounced them both doing well despite Henry's early arrival. "Keep him warm, feed him often, and send for me if he starts looking yellow or stops nursing," she instructed as she prepared to leave. "I'll come back in a few days to check on you both." Hayes drove the midwife home in the wagon, returning mid-morning with a carved wooden cradle that Emma had never seen before. "Where did this come from?" she asked as he set it gently beside her bed. Hayes looked almost embarrassed. "Made it. Been working on it evenings in the barn. Wasn't quite finished, thought I had another month or so, but it'll do." Emma ran her hand over the smooth wood, noting the intricate carvings of leaves and vines along the sides. "It's beautiful, Hayes. Thank you." He shrugged, his eyes on Henry, who slept peacefully in Emma's arms. "Thought he should have something that's his own." The gesture touched Emma deeply. "Would you like to hold him?" Hayes looked startled. "I don't know how. It's not difficult. Here, sit beside me." Hayes perched carefully on the edge of the bed. Emma demonstrated how to support the baby's head and neck, then gently transferred Henry to Hayes's arms. The contrast was striking, the tiny infant cradled against Hayes's broad chest, his large hands holding the baby with exquisite care. "There," Emma said softly. "You're a natural." Hayes didn't respond, his attention completely captured by the sleeping infant. Henry stirred slightly, his tiny face scrunching briefly before relaxing again. A look of wonder crossed Hayes's face, followed by something deeper that made Emma's heart flutter. "Never held a baby before," he admitted quietly. "Not even sure I've been this close to one." "Well, you're doing splendidly." They sat in comfortable silence, Hayes seemingly content to hold the baby while Emma rested beside them. Eventually, Henry began to fuss and Hayes carefully returned him to Emma's arms. "I should let you rest," he said, rising. "Made some stew. I'll bring you a bowl later." "Hayes," Emma called as he reached the door. He turned back, eyebrows raised in question. "Thank you for everything." He nodded once, a small smile touching his lips before he departed. The days that followed established a new rhythm to their life at the ranch. Emma recovered quickly from the birth, though Hayes insisted she take things slowly, often bringing meals to her cabin and taking on many of her duties himself. Henry thrived despite his early arrival, gaining weight steadily and developing a strong pair of lungs that he exercised regularly in the night. By the time Henry was 2 weeks old, Emma had resumed most of her housekeeping duties, though she now brought the baby with her to the main house, settling him in his cradle in the kitchen while she worked. Hayes never objected to the arrangement. In fact, Emma often caught him speaking softly to Henry when he thought she wasn't listening simple things about the ranch, the weather, plans for the day, as though the infant were a valued confidant. One evening in late July, as they sat on the main house porch watching a thunderstorm roll in from the mountains, Hayes broached a subject that had clearly been on his mind. "Been thinking," he said, his eyes on the distant lightning, "about your situation." Emma shifted Henry to her other shoulder, patting his back gently. "My situation? Town thinks you're with me." Hayes's voice was careful, measured, after what I said that day in Wilson's store. "Yes," Emma acknowledged, "I suppose they do. Could make things difficult." "For you and the boy, I mean." Hayes tamped tobacco into his pipe, not meeting her eyes. "When you go into town or when Henry's older." Emma had considered this already. "I suppose so. Though I had thought perhaps I might find a teaching position elsewhere once Henry is a bit older. Start fresh where no one knows our history." Hayes's hand stilled on his pipe. "You're thinking of leaving, eventually," Emma said. "I'm grateful for the position here, but I can't impose forever." "Not an imposition," Hayes said quickly. "Told you before, job's yours as long as you want it." "That's generous, but Henry will need schooling eventually. A community." Hayes was quiet for so long that Emma wondered if he'd heard her. Finally, he said, "What if there was another solution?" "What do you mean?" Hayes struck a match, the flare of light illuminating his face as he lit his pipe. "Could make it real." Emma blinked, uncertain she'd understood. "Make what real?" Hayes exhaled a stream of smoke, his eyes still fixed on the approaching storm. "What the town thinks, that you're with me." Emma's heart began to race. "Hayes, are you?" "Proposing marriage, practical arrangement," he said, though there was a tension in his voice that belied the casual words. "You and Henry would have security, respectability. Ranch needs a woman's touch. Been better since you came." Emma stared at his profile, trying to read his expression in the gathering darkness. Marriage should be more than a practical arrangement. Hayes finally turned to look at her directly. "Could be. In time." The simple statement hung between them, weighted with possibility. Emma looked down at Henry, sleeping peacefully against her shoulder, unaware of the conversation that might determine his future. "You would take on another man's child?" she asked softly. "Would be my child," Hayes said with unexpected fierceness. "In all the ways that matter." Emma felt tears prick her eyes. "Why, Hayes? Why would you do this?" He set his pipe aside and moved closer, his hand coming to rest hesitantly on Henry's tiny back. "Because in 2 months you've brought more life to this place than I managed in 5 years. Because that boy deserves a father who'll stand by him, and because—" He faltered, then continued more quietly, "because I think we could build something good together, Emma." It wasn't a declaration of love, not exactly. Yet Emma sensed that for a man like Hayes, who measured his words carefully and kept his emotions close, it was perhaps as near as he could come. "I need time to think," she said honestly. Hayes nodded, withdrawing his hand. "Of course. No rush to decide." He picked up his pipe again, turning back to watch the storm, which had now reached the edge of the ranch property. "Storm's coming in fast. Should get you and Henry back to your cabin before it hits." The abrupt change of subject was jarring, but Emma understood. Hayes had laid his cards on the table. Now he was giving her space. He walked them to the cabin through the first fat drops of rain, making sure they were settled before heading back to the main house. Emma watched through the window as his figure disappeared into the downpour, her thoughts as turbulent as the storm outside. The matter remained unspoken between them for nearly a week. Emma found herself studying Hayes when he wasn't looking, trying to discern his true feelings. Was this truly just a practical arrangement to him? Or was there something deeper that he couldn't or wouldn't express? She thought of Thomas Wilson, with his flowery compliments and grand promises, all of which had proved as substantial as morning mist. Hayes was different, a man of few words but consistent actions. He had proven his character not through declarations but through countless small kindnesses, through steady reliability, through the tenderness he showed to Henry. Could that be enough to build a marriage on? Emma had once believed herself in love with Thomas, only to discover how little she truly knew him. With Hayes, there was no intoxicating rush of emotion, but rather a steady warmth that had grown gradually over their months together. The decision crystallized one afternoon as Emma nursed Henry in her cabin. She had left bread dough rising in the kitchen of the main house and lost track of time. Realizing it must be overproofed by now, she hurried to finish feeding the baby, intending to run to the house to salvage what she could. As she stepped onto her porch, however, she saw Hayes emerging from the main house, wiping flour from his hands onto his jeans. He caught sight of her and raised a hand in greeting. "Don't worry about the bread," he called, punched it down and shaped it. "It's doing its second rise now." Such a small thing, trivial, really. Yet in that moment, Emma knew. This was a man who noticed what needed doing and did it without being asked, who understood her responsibilities and stepped in without fanfare when she couldn't manage them all. That evening, after Henry was settled in his cradle, Emma walked to the main house. She found Hayes on the porch, whittling what appeared to be a small wooden horse. "For Henry," he explained when he saw her looking. "When he's older." Emma sat beside him on the bench. "I've been thinking about your proposal." Hayes set aside his project, giving her his full attention. "And I have some concerns," she began carefully. "Marriage should be a partnership. I wouldn't want to enter into it feeling forever in your debt." "Never saw it that way," Hayes frowned. "I know, but I would need to feel I'm contributing equally." Hayes nodded slowly. "Seems reasonable. And there's Henry to consider. He would bear your name, be raised as your son." "Would be proud to call him mine," Hayes said simply. Emma took a deep breath. "Then yes, Hayes, I accept your proposal." Something flickered in Hayes's eyes, relief, joy. Emma couldn't quite name it. He reached for her hand, his calloused fingers warm against hers. "Thank you," he said quietly. It wasn't the romantic response novels might have described, but Emma found it perfectly suited to the man before her. Hayes didn't deal in pretty words or grand gestures. His sincerity was in his steadiness, his honor in his actions. "When?" he asked after a moment. Emma considered. "Soon, I think, before summer's end. Nothing elaborate, perhaps Reverend Matthews would come out to the ranch." Hayes snorted softly. "Man doesn't think much of me or our arrangement." "All the more reason to make it official," Emma pointed out. "I'll write to him tomorrow." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, Hayes still holding her hand lightly, as though it were something precious and easily startled away. "Hayes," Emma said eventually, "I need you to know something." She waited until he looked at her directly. "I'm entering this marriage with clear eyes and an open heart. I believe we can build a good life together for us and for Henry." Hayes's expression softened. "That's what I want too, Emma." He hesitated, then added, "Not always good with words. But I promise to be a good husband to you, and a father to Henry." The simple vow meant more to Emma than 1,000 poetic declarations. She leaned forward and for the first time pressed a gentle kiss to Hayes's cheek. His skin was warm beneath her lips, the stubble of his beard rough against her skin. When she pulled back, Hayes looked momentarily stunned. Then a slow smile spread across his face, the full, unguarded smile she'd seen so rarely. "Should probably get to town soon," he said after a moment. "Get a proper ring." Emma shook her head. "There's no need for extravagance." "Not extravagance," Hayes corrected. "Tradition. And I'm thinking we might need a few other things. Supplies for the wedding, maybe some fabric for a new dress if you want it." Emma hadn't considered a new dress, but the thought was appealing. "Perhaps you're right. When should we go?" "Day after tomorrow. I need to check on a section of fence first, but then we could make a day of it." Emma nodded. "I'll make preparations for Henry." As she walked back to her cabin later, Emma felt a curious lightness in her chest. She had not expected to find herself an engaged woman again, certainly not so soon after Henry's birth. Yet there was a rightness to it that she couldn't deny. This was not the path she had envisioned for herself when she'd come west, but perhaps it was the one she was meant to find. The journey to Salida 2 days later was both familiar and entirely new. Emma sat beside Hayes in the wagon, Henry securely nestled in her arms, watching the landscape unfold around them. They spoke easily of ranch matters, plans for the coming fall, the supplies they needed from town. If there was a new awareness between them, a subtle tension that hadn't been there before, neither mentioned it. As they approached Salida, Emma felt a flutter of anxiety. She hadn't returned since leaving with Hayes months earlier, and she knew their arrival together would cause a stir. "Nervous?" Hayes asked, seeming to read her thoughts. "A little," Emma admitted. "It will be different coming back." Hayes nodded, understanding. "People will talk, but things have changed." Indeed they had. Emma was no longer the desperate, shunned young woman she'd been in April. She had a healthy son, a home, and soon a husband. Whatever judgments the town might pass seemed less important now. Their first stop was the general store Wilson's, where their journey together had begun. The bell jangled as they entered, Hayes holding the door for Emma, who carried Henry wrapped in a soft blanket. Wilson looked up from behind the counter, recognition and surprise flickering across his face. "Mr. Shaw, Miss Turner." His eyes went to the bundle in Emma's arms. "I see congratulations are in order." "Thank you," Emma said with more confidence than she felt. "This is my son, Henry." Wilson came around the counter, propriety evidently forgotten in his curiosity. "Fine-looking boy," he said, peering at the infant's sleeping face. "Takes after his mother." Hayes placed a hand at the small of Emma's back, the gesture both supportive and subtly possessive. "We need supplies, Wilson, and a few special items." "Special items?" Wilson's eyebrows rose. "Miss Turner and I are to be married," Hayes said matter-of-factly. "Thought we might find a ring if you carry such things." Wilson's expression was almost comical in its astonishment. "Married? Well, that's wonderful news." He recovered his composure quickly. "Got a selection of rings in the display case. Not much, but good quality." As Wilson hurried to unlock the glass case, Emma saw other customers in the store exchanging glances and whispers. She held her head high, refusing to be cowed by their gossip. The selection of rings was indeed limited, but Emma's eye was immediately drawn to a simple gold band with a small pearl set in the center. "That one," Hayes said, noticing her interest. "How much, Wilson?" The price was more than Emma had expected, and she began to protest, but Hayes shook his head. "It's the one you want," he said simply. And that was that. While Wilson wrapped the ring, they gathered the other supplies they needed. Emma selected fabric for a new dress, a soft blue calico that Hayes said matched her eyes along with thread and buttons. They added food staples and a few special items for the wedding meal to their order. As Wilson tallied their purchases, the bell over the door jangled again. Emma turned to see Reverend Matthews enter, his eyes widening as he spotted them. "Miss Turner, Mr. Shaw." His greeting was polite but cool. "I understand congratulations are in order." Word traveled fast in Salida, Emma thought. "Thank you, Reverend. In fact, we were planning to call on you today." "Oh." The preacher's expression was guarded. "We'd like to discuss you performing our wedding ceremony," Hayes said directly. "At the ranch, if you're willing." Matthews studied them both for a long moment. "Perhaps we should speak privately." Hayes nodded. "Wilson will be back for our purchases." They followed the Reverend to his small office behind the church. Once seated, Matthews folded his hands on his desk and regarded them seriously. "I must say, this is unexpected. When you left town, Miss Turner, there were assumptions made about your arrangement with Mr. Shaw." "I'm aware," Emma said calmly. "Those assumptions were incorrect. Mr. Shaw offered me a position as his housekeeper with separate accommodations." "I see." Matthews looked skeptical. "And now you wish to marry?" "Yes," Hayes said firmly. "We've come to care for each other, want to make a proper family for Emma and the boy." The Reverend's gaze shifted to Henry, who had awakened and was making small noises in Emma's arms. "The child is not yours, Mr. Shaw. Not by blood," Hayes acknowledged. "Will be in all the ways that matter once we're married." Matthews sighed. "You understand my concern. The circumstances are unusual." "Life often is," Emma said, "but our intentions are honorable, Reverend. We're asking you to sanctify our union before God and to welcome Henry into the community of faith through baptism, if you're willing." The mention of baptism seemed to soften the Reverend's expression. "You wish the child baptized?" "Of course," Emma said. "Every child deserves God's blessing." Matthews was quiet for a moment, considering. "The wedding, when did you have in mind?" 2 weeks from Saturday, Hayes suggested. "Gives us time to prepare, and it's before the fall roundup begins." "At the ranch, you said?" Hayes nodded. "Small gathering, few ranch hands, neighbors, Mrs. Lawson, who midwifed the birth." "Very well," Matthews said finally. "I'll come out to perform the ceremony, and we can discuss baptism for the child afterward." Relief washed through Emma. Having the Reverend's blessing wouldn't silence all the gossip, but it would give their union legitimacy in the eyes of the community. "Thank you, Reverend," she said sincerely. As they left the church, Emma noticed how Hayes walked closer to her than before, his hand occasionally brushing hers. In front of Wilson's store, they encountered Mrs. Hollister, Emma's former landlady, whose eyes went wide at the sight of them. "Miss Turner, and the baby, my goodness, he's beautiful." She peered at Henry, then glanced between Emma and Hayes. "I hear congratulations are in order." "News travels fast," Hayes commented dryly. Mrs. Hollister had the grace to look slightly abashed. "Small town. We're all so pleased you've made an honest woman of her, Mr. Shaw." Emma felt Hayes stiffen beside her. "Emma was always honest," he said flatly. "Town just wasn't listening." Before Mrs. Hollister could respond, Hayes guided Emma back into the store, his hand firm at her waist. They completed their purchases and loaded the wagon in silence. It wasn't until they were well outside town that Hayes spoke. "Sorry about that." Mrs. Hollister's comment. Emma shifted Henry to her shoulder, patting his back soothingly. "It's all right. I expected as much. Still ain't right." Hayes's hands tightened on the reins. "Acting like you've done something terrible when half the men in that town have done worse." "It's the way of things," Emma said simply. "Women bear the visible evidence of indiscretion. Men walk away unchanged." Hayes was quiet for a long moment. "Not all men." The words were soft but carried weight. Emma looked at his profile, strong and steady against the backdrop of mountains. "No," she agreed. "Not all men." The ride home was peaceful, Henry sleeping contentedly for most of the journey. As they crested the final hill before the ranch came into view, Hayes slowed the wagon. "Been meaning to ask," he said, sounding uncharacteristically hesitant. "After we're married, would you want to move into the main house? Plenty of room. But if you'd prefer to keep your cabin for a while, I'd understand." The question caught Emma by surprise. She hadn't considered the practical aspects of their living arrangements after the wedding. The main house was certainly more spacious, with room for Henry to grow. Yet the prospect of sharing a home and presumably a bed with Hayes brought a flush to her cheeks. "I think," she said carefully, "that a husband and wife should share a home, don't you?" Hayes nodded, his expression unreadable. "Just wanted you to know you have a choice, Emma. Always will with me." The simple promise meant more than elaborate vows might have. "Thank you," she said softly. "And yes, I would like to move into the main house. It's a lovely home, Hayes. You've built something beautiful here." Something in his expression eased, a tension she hadn't fully registered until it was gone. "Been just a house till now," he said quietly. "You and Henry will make it a home." The words warmed Emma to her core, and she found herself looking forward to their future with unexpected eagerness. The 2 weeks before the wedding passed in a flurry of preparation. Emma sewed her wedding dress in the evenings, a simple but elegant creation in the soft blue fabric they'd purchased. Hayes built a larger cradle for Henry to use in the main house, along with a small chest of drawers for the baby's things. The ranch hands, when informed of the upcoming wedding, reacted with enthusiastic approval. They offered to handle extra chores so Hayes could focus on wedding preparations, and one man's wife volunteered to bake the wedding cake. Emma found herself touched by the community's response. These people who lived scattered across the hills around Shaw Ranch had accepted her without question or judgment, welcoming both her and Henry into their circle with genuine warmth. The night before the wedding, Hayes insisted Emma retire early. "Big day tomorrow," he said as they finished supper. "Got something to show you first, though." Curious, Emma followed him upstairs, Henry sleeping in her arms. Hayes led her to the bedroom at the end of the hall, the master bedroom she had never entered. "Made some changes," he explained, opening the door. "Hope you like them." Emma stepped inside and caught her breath. The room had been transformed from the Spartan bachelor's quarters she had glimpsed months ago. A beautiful quilt in shades of blue and green covered the large bed. Curtains that matched the quilt hung at the windows, and a rocking chair sat in the corner beside a small table with a lamp. Most surprising of all was the smaller cradle positioned near the bed, not the new one Hayes had built, but a more elaborate piece with delicate carvings along its sides. "Hayes, it's beautiful," she said, running her hand along the smooth wood. "Where did it come from?" A touch of color rose in Hayes's cheeks. "Was mine as a baby. My mother sent it when I wrote to tell her about the wedding and Henry. Arrived yesterday." Emma looked up in surprise. "You wrote to your family about us?" Hayes nodded. "Mother's pleased. Says she always knew I'd find the right woman eventually. Wants to meet you and Henry someday." The knowledge that Hayes had shared their news with his family, that he had claimed Henry so completely in his letters home, filled Emma with unexpected emotion. "Thank you," she whispered, blinking back tears. "For everything." Hayes reached out hesitantly, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Should thank you, Emma, for saying yes." There was a moment brief but charged with possibility when Emma thought he might kiss her. Instead, he stepped back, his hand falling to his side. "Should get some rest," he said, his voice slightly rougher than usual. "See you tomorrow." Emma nodded, suddenly shy. "Tomorrow." She spent her last night in the cabin with a curious mixture of nostalgia and anticipation. This small space had been her sanctuary, the place where Henry had been born, where she had begun to rebuild her life. Yet she looked forward to the next chapter, to creating a true home with Hayes in the main house. Morning dawned clear and bright, the late August sun warming the land as Emma dressed for her wedding. She had just finished feeding Henry when a knock came at her door. "It's Mrs. Lawson," called a familiar voice. "Come to help the bride prepare," the midwife bustled in, arms full of wildflowers. "Thought you might want these for your hair," she explained, setting them on the table. "And an extra pair of hands with the little one while you dress." Emma accepted both offerings gratefully. With Mrs. Lawson cooing over Henry, she donned her new dress, arranged her hair, and pinned a small cluster of wildflowers at her temple. "You look beautiful, dear," Mrs. Lawson declared when Emma emerged from the bedroom. "That man won't know what hit him." Emma blushed. "I hope it's not too simple." "Nonsense. It's perfect." The older woman adjusted Emma's collar slightly. "Hayes Shaw isn't a man who needs fancy trappings. He knows true value when he sees it." By noon, the yard between the main house and barn had been transformed. Hayes and the ranch hands had constructed a simple arbor, woven with late summer flowers and greenery. Benches and chairs borrowed from neighboring ranches provided seating for the small gathering of guests. Emma watched from her cabin window as Reverend Matthews arrived, followed by several wagons carrying neighbors and their families. Hayes greeted them all, looking handsome and slightly uncomfortable in a clean white shirt and dark vest. "Time to go, dear," Mrs. Lawson said, handing Henry to Emma. The baby was awake and alert, dressed in a new gown Emma had sewn from leftover wedding dress fabric. The short walk from the cabin to the arbor felt momentous. Guests turned to watch as Emma approached, Henry in her arms, Mrs. Lawson at her side. But Emma's eyes were fixed on Hayes, who stood waiting beneath the arbor, his expression one of undisguised wonder as he watched her come to him. The ceremony was simple and brief. Reverend Matthews spoke of duty and commitment, of building a life together under God's guidance. When the time came for Hayes to place the ring on Emma's finger, his hands were steady, his eyes never leaving hers. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the Reverend declared. "You may kiss your bride." For a moment, Hayes seemed uncertain. Then, with infinite gentleness, he leaned forward and pressed his lips to Emma's in a kiss that was brief but tender. It was their first kiss, and as Hayes drew back, Emma saw something new in his eyes, a warmth and promise that made her heart race. The celebration that followed was joyful and relaxed. Tables set up near the barn held a feast prepared by neighbors: roast beef, fresh vegetables from late summer gardens, pies and cakes of various descriptions. Children played in the yard while adults congratulated the newlyweds and admired baby Henry. "He's got your eyes," one neighbor told Hayes, apparently assuming the baby was his by blood. Hayes didn't correct the misconception, instead smiling down at Henry with unmistakable pride. "Smart boy, too," he said. "Gets that from his mother." As the afternoon waned into evening, guests began to depart, each offering final congratulations before heading home. Reverend Matthews, who had remained longer than Emma expected, approached them as the last wagon pulled away. "A fine celebration," he said, his earlier reservations seemingly forgotten. "And a fine community you have here." "Thank you for coming all this way," Emma said sincerely. "When might you bring the child for baptism?" the Reverend asked. Hayes and Emma exchanged glances. "Perhaps in a few weeks," Hayes suggested. "When things settle," Matthews nodded. "Very well, and may I offer a word of advice?" At their nods, he continued more gently than Emma had expected. "Marriage is sacred work. Build it on honesty, respect, and patience. The rest will follow." After the Reverend's departure, Emma and Hayes found themselves alone for the first time as husband and wife. They stood in the yard, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple. "Should get your things moved to the house," Hayes said after a moment. "If you're ready." Emma nodded. "Yes, I think so." They walked to the cabin together, Henry sleeping against Emma's shoulder. Inside, Hayes gathered Emma's trunk while she collected the baby's things. It took only 2 trips to transfer her possessions to the main house. In the master bedroom, their bedroom now, Emma laid Henry in his cradle while Hayes brought up the last of her belongings. "That's everything," he said, setting down a box of books. Emma nodded, suddenly uncertain. The intimacy of sharing a bedroom, a bed, loomed large between them. Hayes seemed to sense her nervousness. "I can sleep in the spare room," he offered quietly. "Till you're comfortable." The offer touched Emma deeply. "No," she said after a moment. "That's not necessary. We're married now, Hayes." He studied her face carefully. "Marriage certificate doesn't give me any rights you're not ready to give, Emma." His consideration, his willingness to wait, confirmed for Emma that she had made the right choice in this man. "I appreciate that," she said softly, "but I meant what I said before the Reverend today. I'm your wife now in all ways." Hayes's expression softened. He crossed to her slowly as though approaching a nervous colt and raised one hand to cup her cheek. "No rush," he murmured. "Got a lifetime ahead of us." This time, when he lowered his head to kiss her, there was no audience, no reverend watching. The kiss was still gentle but held more warmth, more promise. Emma found herself responding, her hands coming up to rest on his chest. When they parted, Hayes rested his forehead against hers for a moment. "Been wanting to do that for a while," he admitted. "How long?" Emma asked, curious. A smile touched his lips. "Since that day in Wilson's store, if I'm honest. Something about the way you held your head up despite everything made me want to know you better." The admission surprised and pleased her. "I thought you were just being kind." "Was being selfish, truth be told," Hayes said. "Saw a chance to have you at the ranch and took it." His thumb traced the line of her jaw. "Best decision I ever made." Henry stirred in his cradle, making small, fussy noises that signaled he would soon wake for a feeding. Hayes stepped back reluctantly. "Should let you tend to him," he said. "I'll check on things downstairs, make sure everything's locked up for the night." When he returned some time later, Emma had fed and changed Henry and was sitting in the rocking chair, humming softly to the drowsy infant. Hayes paused in the doorway, watching them with an expression that made Emma's heart turn over. "He's almost asleep," she whispered. "Been a big day for him, too." Hayes crossed the room quietly and knelt beside the chair. "Can I?" he asked, holding out his arms. Emma transferred the baby to him, watching as Hayes cradled Henry against his chest and rose to pace slowly around the room. "Sleep now, son," he murmured. "Tomorrow's a new day, son." The words, spoken so naturally, brought tears to Emma's eyes. Hayes might not be Henry's father by blood, but in that moment, Emma knew that the distinction would never matter. Hayes had claimed them both, fully and without reservation. When Henry was finally settled in his cradle, Hayes turned to find Emma still watching him, her eyes shining in the lamplight. "What is it?" he asked. "You called him son," she said simply. Hayes nodded. "That's what he is now." "Yes," Emma agreed, rising from the chair. "And you're my husband." She went to him then, her earlier nervousness forgotten in the face of her growing certainty. Hayes opened his arms to her, and Emma stepped into his embrace as naturally as if she had been doing so for years. Later, as they lay together in the darkness, Emma's head pillowed on Hayes's chest, she felt a contentment she had never expected to find. This man beside her, her husband, had given her not just his name and his protection, but his heart, offered quietly and without fanfare. "Hayes," she whispered, unsure if he was still awake. His voice rumbled beneath her ear. I'm glad I came to Salida despite everything. If I hadn't, I wouldn't have found you." His arm tightened around her. "Was thinking the same thing. Funny how life works sometimes." "Yes," Emma agreed, nestling closer. "Funny indeed." The months that followed were a time of adjustment and growing closeness for the newly formed Shaw family. Fall brought the cattle roundup, keeping Hayes busy from dawn until dusk. Emma established new routines in the main house, caring for Henry while maintaining the household and preparing meals for Hayes, and occasionally the ranch hands. Henry thrived under their care, growing sturdy and strong despite his early arrival. His baptism in October became a community celebration, with neighbors gathering afterward at the ranch for a feast that lasted well into the evening. Hayes stood proudly beside Emma as Reverend Matthews performed the ceremony, officially welcoming Henry Turner Shaw into the church. By the time winter settled over the ranch, draping the mountains in snow and painting the landscape in shades of white and gray, Emma and Hayes had developed a comfortable rhythm to their days. Evenings were spent in the warmth of the main room, Hayes often working on small woodworking projects while Emma sewed or read aloud from one of the books they both enjoyed. Their nights were equally companionable, their physical relationship having developed naturally from tentative beginnings to a passionate connection that still sometimes left Emma breathless. Hayes was a considerate lover, attentive to her needs and seemingly amazed by her responsiveness to his touch. "Never thought it could be like this," he admitted one night as they lay entwined beneath the heavy quilts, the December wind howling outside their window. "With Mary the girl back east we never. Well, it wouldn't have been proper." Emma smiled in the darkness, tracing patterns on his chest with her fingertips. "And this is proper, Mr. Shaw. We're married," he reminded her, catching her hand and bringing it to his lips. "Very proper indeed." Emma laughed softly. "I'm glad you think so." Hayes rolled to his side, propping himself on one elbow to look down at her. In the faint light from the banked fire, his expression was serious. "Emma, are you happy here with me?" The question surprised her. "Of course I am. Why would you ask?" Hayes shrugged, a gesture she felt rather than saw in the darkness. "Sometimes wonder if you miss town life, teaching, other people." Emma reached up to touch his face, feeling the rough texture of his beard against her palm. "I miss teaching sometimes," she acknowledged honestly. "But I have no regrets, Hayes. This life, our life, is more than I ever hoped for." He turned his face to press a kiss to her palm. "Been thinking about that, teaching, I mean." "Oh, ranch is doing well. Could afford to build a proper schoolroom come spring. Neighbor children could come here for lessons." Emma sat up, suddenly wide awake. "Hayes, are you serious, if it would make you happy?" He sat up as well, reaching to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear. "You're a teacher, Emma. Shouldn't have to give that up." The thoughtfulness of the gesture, the way Hayes had considered her dreams and sought to incorporate them into their life together, moved Emma deeply. "I love you," she said, the words emerging unbidden but true. Hayes went very still. They had not spoken of love before, though Emma had felt it growing within her for months. Now, having said the words, she felt both vulnerable and liberated. "Emma," Hayes whispered, his voice rough with emotion. He gathered her close, burying his face in her hair. "I love you too. Have for a long time now." The admission seemed to break something open between them. Hayes drew back to look at her, then kissed her with a passion that left no doubt of his feelings. Emma responded in kind, her earlier sleepiness forgotten as they reaffirmed their connection in the most intimate way possible. Afterward, as they lay catching their breath, Hayes said quietly, "Never thought I'd have this. After the war, after what I saw and did there. Didn't think I deserved it." Emma rolled to face him. Hayes, what happened during the war? He was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. Finally, he sighed. Was a sharpshooter. Good one. Too good, maybe. Killed men I never met from distances where they couldn't even see me. His voice grew distant. Remember their faces sometimes. When they fell. Emma laid her hand on his chest, feeling his heartbeat strong and steady beneath her palm. You were a soldier doing your duty. Maybe. Still took lives. Hayes covered her hand with his. When I came back, couldn't stand being in the city. Too many people, too many reminders. Came west looking for space to breathe. And found this place, Emma finished for him. Found peace for a while, found purpose in building something instead of destroying. He turned his head to look at her. Then found you, and everything changed again. For the better, I hope, Emma said softly. Hayes nodded. For the better. You and Henry, you've given me something I never thought I'd have. A family. A future worth building. Emma kissed him gently. We'll build it together, Hayes. By spring, Hayes had made good on his promise. A small schoolhouse took shape near the main house. Simple but sturdy, with windows that caught the morning light and enough space for a dozen students. Word spread among the scattered ranches and homesteads that Miss Emma misses. Shaw now would be teaching school 3 days a week once planting was done. Henry, now approaching his first birthday, was walking with the assistance of furniture edges and his parents' patient hands. His dark hair and blue eyes reminded Emma of Thomas Wilson, but his determined spirit and serious expression when concentrating were pure Hayes. In April, just before the school was to open, Emma made a discovery that both thrilled and terrified her. After several mornings of nausea and unusual fatigue, she recognized the signs. She waited until evening to tell Hayes, after Henry was sleeping soundly in his crib, which had replaced the cradle he had outgrown. Hayes, she began as they sat together on the porch watching the spring twilight deepen. I have news. He turned to her, eyebrows raised in question. I'm with child again, she said simply. Our child this time. Hayes's expression transformed from surprise to wonder to joy in the space of a heartbeat. Emma, he breathed, reaching for her hands. Are you certain? She nodded. All the signs are there. The baby should come in late November, I think. Hayes pulled her into his arms, holding her as though she were made of glass. A baby, he whispered against her hair. Our baby. Are you pleased? Emma asked, though his reaction had already answered the question. Hayes drew back to look at her, his eyes suspiciously bright in the fading light. More than I can say. He placed a gentle hand on her still flat stomach. Another child to love. You already love Henry so completely, Emma said softly. I sometimes forget he isn't yours by blood. Is mine in all the ways that matter, Hayes said firmly. This new little one won't change that. Emma believed him. She had watched Hayes with Henry over the past year, seen his infinite patience, his gentle guidance, his obvious pride in every milestone. This man who had once worried he didn't deserve happiness had proven himself worthy of it 1,000 times over. I was thinking, Hayes said after a moment, his hand still resting on her abdomen. If it's a girl, might we call her Mary, after my mother? Mary Shaw, Emma said, testing the name. It's beautiful, and if it's another boy, Hayes considered. James, perhaps, after your father. The thoughtfulness of the suggestion brought tears to Emma's eyes. Yes, I'd like that. As darkness fell around them, they sat together on the porch, making plans for the future, the school, the new baby, improvements to the ranch. Emma rested her head on Hayes's shoulder, content in the knowledge that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. Never thought, that day in Wilson's store, that this is where we'd end up, Hayes mused. You shunned by the town, me standing beside you saying she's with me. Didn't know then how true those words would become. "You saw something in me that day," Emma said. "Something worth standing up for." "Saw courage," Hayes replied, "and pride. Knew right then you were different from anyone I'd met before." Emma smiled. "And I saw a good man, one willing to defend a stranger simply because it was right." Hayes pressed a kiss to her temple. "Not strangers anymore." "No," Emma agreed softly. "Not strangers at all." As stars appeared in the vast Colorado sky above them, Emma thought of the journey that had brought her to this moment, the hardships and losses, the unexpected joys, the love she had found when she least expected it. Life had not followed the path she had imagined for herself, but sitting here with Hayes, their child growing within her and their son sleeping peacefully inside, she couldn't imagine wanting any other fate than the one she had found. "Come inside, wife," Hayes said eventually, rising and offering her his hand. "Tomorrow will be here soon enough." Emma placed her hand in his, allowing him to help her to her feet. "Yes," she agreed, "and I find I'm looking forward to it." Together they walked into the house, their home, closing the door on the night and opening it to their shared future, built on a foundation of respect, understanding, and love that had grown from the most unlikely of beginnings.